First of all, welcome everybody. Today in Brussels, it's actually not clouded. It's actually very clear and sunny today. But we are talking about cloud solutions and the development in Europe and globally. What does it mean for our resilience? How do we regulate or not regulate? How do we certify? And how can the usual companies basically address their concerns, as they are not European, but global companies also? What will this mean to them? And how can we address these challenges? We both have user companies here, we have cloud companies here, and we of course have the Parliament, the Commission, and also ENISA here, the body that will implement the certifications. So a big thank you for all of you who joined this morning. Let me start by presenting our first panelists and who we have in the room today. Please, next slide, Anna. So I would start by welcoming, of course, Pierre Castagnier. He is head of unit for cloud and software in GD Connect. We work very closely with Pierre, and he should be the one who has more or less the overview of everything that affects the environment on the regulatory agenda. Welcome, Pierre. We also have Barbara Navarro, of course, from Santander, and of course, one of the sectors that is highly digital and moving into the cloud. So banking sector is definitely one of them. High security needs, also, you know, in the midst of all this cloud discussion. We have Bart Borthuis, who is a member of Parliament, and also very active on the cloud agenda, looking very much to hear also the Parliament view. We have Andreas Mitrakas, and we work very closely with Andreas because he is on all the certifications in ENISA, a body in Athens that is responsible for all certifications on cloud, but also on cybersecurity and other areas. We also welcome Johan Klukens. So he is the Director of Certification Services at the Center of Cybersecurity of Belgium. So very good to have also a member state view on this, and how does it look from the chair of Belgium on this agenda. We have a cloud provider, Oracle, and Samantha Hathaway, who's going to present us, you know, how is this, the technical solutions on this, and how can we actually address these things. We have Thomas Hahn from Siemens, another important European user company who is facing all these regulations and new rules on cloud, and of course is super dependent on cloud solutions, both on their own solutions and maybe other supplier solutions in the future to run their global business. We have Anissa Kemiche, who is the European head of the French Association, member of Digital Europe, Numéum, and also representing, of course, businesses, but also smaller businesses and how they see these challenges. Last but not least, we have Alberto from my team, who will take over once the intro is over and guide you through the session of discussions on cloud. Let's look at the framework and what this means. So, I mean, when we look at it right now, the state of the data flows is right now that 91% of the European companies are transferring personal data outside of Europe. Why? Well, simply because they have subsidiaries around the world, and they need, of course, to be able to communicate, share, analyze, and use data across their companies across the world. This applies to, as you see, nearly all companies in Europe. And of course, this is one of the things that if this gets disrupted, we are in a very bad situation. So we need to make sure that it doesn't get disrupted and that companies can continue. Might be a bit delayed for many European companies, but their development in the data and technology transformation of their businesses, often not in the tech sector, but in highly digital and transforming industries. Then, of course, I mean, many of these companies are already facing extremely high costs on GDPR compliance and many other compliance components. So the ones who are, I would say, either on very small margins or smaller they sometimes still have to hire lawyers instead of people in business, people in sales, people in innovation. So how do we make sure that we do this in a very agile way so their cost is not going to explode and they can continue their journey to become competitive instead of just becoming a company of lawyers? Last but not least, we have made a study, I believe around 2.5, 3 years ago, which basically showed that kind of disruption will actually lead to around 2 trillion losses for the European industries. This is a very big component of how we have acted in the last many, I would say 100 years, but at least many centuries. So it's nothing new. There is no change in how we do business. This can be changed, but then we will face a huge slowdown in how we innovate, how we collaborate, and how we expand our European businesses outside Europe and work with talent outside Europe also. So let's look at the next slide, please, and what this actually looks like in practice, looking at all the legislations that are coming our way. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here we go. We, of course, have a lot of different sectorial legislations, meaning that, you know, banking, health, many of the highly regulated sectors, they already are compliant with a lot of very strict rules on how to share data, on how to do their businesses. It has been a very costly affair. So how do we make sure that we don't have these overlapping clauses in new regulation that will, you know, bring even more confusion and even, you know, bring down the security of these highly regulated sectors? This is exactly why we have a banking company here today. We could also have a pharma company. The issues would have been the same. But also companies, for example, in manufacturing that have very high regulations in safety, healthy, and many other regulations already coming their way. Well, then, of course, we have the DSA, we have the DMA, we have the Data Act, we have the Data Governance Act, we have the GDPR, we have the e-privacy, we have the discussion on the transatlantic data flows, hopefully, knock on wood, now very stable with one of our biggest security partners in the world. Security regulation directly, we have NIS2, we have EU cloud certification schemes, we have Gaia-X, which is not really a regulation, but more a private initiative. Then we have voluntary initiatives like SWIPO, EU Cloud, we have EU Industrial Cloud Alliance. So a lot of different frameworks where we are looking at, I would say, a very cloudy framework, and it will be very inefficient and damaging for the cloud uptake, and not least for the security, if we don't get this right. One thing I might also just mention here is that cloud is not only about moving to the cloud and it will be more easy and we can, you know, optimize how we handle data, innovate better, etc., but it is also a question of security. We have learned a lot from Ukraine. Ukraine has collaborated with big cloud providers for a long time, and therefore they were able to move all that data out in time for the society still to be functional, because they had a cloud resilient strategy on and a close collaboration with private sector on actually how to handle this. So this is not just about sovereignty, it's not just about who, when, why, and how. This is about, will we be competitive? How do we get this right so we don't slow the European businesses and their international expansions down? And how will we make sure that the best cloud solution enables the society to function, should we be in, and God forbid it, in a situation where stakeholders would have malicious attacks towards Europe? Let us move to the next slide, please, and look at, you know, some of the goals of the European Commission. So it says digital decade. We set a target of 75 cloud uptake of European business by 2030. And well, in 2021, it was 41. We just discussed here before this session started, we just discussed maybe it's time for Digital Europe to survey the now 100,000 companies that we represent to see, you know, is cloud uptake slowed down? And if so, what are the reasons? It might be a very good exercise to basically understand the dynamics of smaller companies of different sectors, etc. So I don't know what the status is now in 2023, but it would definitely be very beneficial to actually know much more about that, and we are very willing to contribute to that. Okay, so let's look at what the big questions would be today. For me, I mean, I hope that we will have a good discussion, that all the business stakeholders will really explain, you know, what their concrete issues or opportunities are here, and how, you know, we could have suggestions to either improve or change things in the regulations, because that's of course our role to give concrete advice. And I hope that the policymakers here will, you know, of course, listen, which they always do, but also fill us in what the thoughts were and how they are looking at right now and solving some of these overlap of regulations or some of the challenges for businesses to actually handle the current established processes of how they grow and do business. And last but not least, of course, I hope that we will have a frank discussion. I always say that policy is not made out of itself. It's made because we have good, frank discussions, and that we share and that we listen and we find common solutions. So I hope that is what we will do also today. Well, first of all, how can we enable European businesses keep doing business in Europe and globally, because they are all global, that the majority of the European companies have their highest profits and big market shares outside Europe. So how do we make sure that that they actually maintain a competitive edge on this? I think that is the most important question. And unless we have an answer to that, then it will be very difficult, because in the end, we need competitive companies that are also have a global role in our leading industries, whether that is banking, whether that is health, whether that is manufacturing. So one other thing, I mean, of course, I mean, how this landscape will affect them. What do we foresee, and how can we counter that, you know, unforeseen consequences for the European businesses here? Last but not least, of course, for states, there is something about strategic autonomy or sovereignty. What does that mean? Does it mean that you need to be on the best cloud solution, that you have a strategy, or does that mean something else? You know, so what is it? What are the basic needs for not the private sector, but for the public sector, that are the biggest worries at the moment? So with that, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you to Zoe from my team for launching this, and thank you to Alberto for facilitating these talks today. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia, for that great overview. And we have a lot of speakers today, great speakers at that, to guide us through all the topics that you have illustrated. So our challenge will be to do them justice, because we have just over 1 hour to go through this discussion. We'll do it by dividing our discussion into 2 segments. One that looks more at the big picture of the cloud market and what's influencing the cloud market in Europe. There's many factors. Legislation is one of them, but not the only one. And the second segment would look more specifically at how security, the security outlook and security requirements are influencing, if you will, the future of the sector there. So I'm going to, first of all, as you said, we want to make this discussion dynamic, so people should be free to react to what other speakers will have said. And I will ping people individually to kickstart the discussion. I want to start with Bart Groothuis, a member of the European Parliament, a security expert. Among the many things that you've done, you've been rapporteur on the flagship piece of legislation that deals with security critical services in Europe, the NIS2 reform. And you've seen the stats that Cecilia showed, the latest stats from Eurostat from 2021. That number of 41% of companies in Europe using cloud, and only half of those using advanced services beyond the basics of email and storing files, etc. How do you look at those stats? Do you think they're a major problem? Do you think that they can be, what do you think the reasons for that are? And possibly how can we get those numbers up to 75% and more?
Well, the best way to get those numbers up is to create added and surplus value for businesses and SMEs. And I guess if you're into any company wanting to do anything with artificial intelligence or big data or what you have, you need Google, IBM, AWS, and Microsoft. You need those companies because they offer cheap, well-crafted services, and they are from like-minded countries. So I very much commend businesses taking that surplus value, and thus economic growth for Europe. That's the reason I say it. But there is a disparity between the countries in Europe. In my country, the Netherlands, where I'm at, as you can see the beach in Scheveningen here, about 65% of the companies are already into the cloud, also advanced cloud services. So a good infrastructure, ecosystems will enhance that. But I think that if I speak to my constituents and companies, they say they need a more rule harmonization because the costs for all conformity studies or certification and standards, it's a lot, and we need more of that. And so a clear EU rule book would actually help, also through certification. Not with the sovereignty requirements as currently crafted, but I guess that's something that I would really commend, and making information flowing between us and our like-minded partners will actually enable growth, and it will enable European businesses to flourish even more. So that's something that I would like to offer here.
Thanks a lot, Bart. Next up, I will go to Pierre, because Pierre is the head of unit for cloud and software at Connect at the European Commission. So if there's one person who can see through the mist of clouds in the cloud market, that's you, Pierre. You've seen also the foggy, cloudy slide with all and they're not all the pieces of legislation that apply to cloud possibly, but there's starting to be like a lot of legislation in this field. And obviously the European Commission will have looked at the various initiatives trying to make sure that from a legal perspective, everything can fit together, et cetera. From a business perspective, we're perhaps starting to see some unease with the complexity of, let's say, fragmentation of the framework potentially. And among other things, there's the announcement of the cloud rulebook and other initiatives that your unit, among others, is clearly leading. So where do you think we're at? Is this, are you starting to feel that it may be a bit too much as well, and that we need to consolidate? How do you see this playing out in the next few years?
Okay, good morning, everyone, and many thanks to Digital Europe for organizing this very timely event. Let us take a step back for a minute and look at cloud policies. Cloud is actually one of the least regulated sector in the digital sphere. If you compare it to the telecom, for instance, there are barely any regulation for the cloud sector. But generally, this has been very consistent with the approach that the Commission has taken on cloud. We have been taking a tradition of working very closely with industry, with the providers, but also with the users, and try to find common ways to harmonize the operation on the market. So work through the development of self-regulation, co-regulation. Of course, there are other legislation whose implementation must be translated for cloud services, and that's not always trivial. GDPR, just to name an example, the very good principle, but when it comes to cascading this down to practical implementation into the cloud, it's pretty complex. So we have seen the added value of self-regulation and co-regulation for this type of implementation. And I can say that this has actually worked quite well. We're not challenging today this approach, so we don't intend to come heavy-handed on the cloud industry in that respect. So a lot of codes of conduct have been developed, standards, certification mechanism. Cecilia was mentioning the code of conduct on data protection for the GDPR. We have European code of conduct on energy efficiency for data center, which is now fully anchored into European taxonomy. So it shows the big added value of this self-regulation, co-regulation mechanism. But we do get it. Things have started to get a bit scattered all over the place as we have addressed different aspects of cloud operation. So we understand the need to start bringing all of this back into a single umbrella to make it understandable, readable for cloud providers to know what they have to comply with, and for cloud users to know what they can expect from their provider. So that's the whole idea of the European Cloud Rulebook. Bring all of this self-regulation, standardization effort under a single umbrella. This is not meant to be carved in stone. So we want this to be dynamic and to make it evolve over time as new rules will inevitably come up. So this is meant to be dynamic. We don't have precise timings yet on when this could be made available, but of course we will all love to get some Christmas present on the cloud. So let's see how this goes. Just a few addition there on self-regulation, because we have also seen that sometimes it did not work out. Interoperability, for instance, proved very difficult to achieve solid consensus on the possibility to switch among different cloud service providers. But that's okay. So the Commission took stock of this, and we tried to intervene through legislation in the Data Act on those aspects of cloud switching. The negotiation have been concluded among the co-legislator, and I think we have a very good outcome. It will really create solid ground for users to switch easily from one cloud service provider to the others. And it will allow to develop a common mechanism of interoperability in the cloud. Everybody is going to benefit from this. The Data Act is also catering for the protection of data against unlawful access, which is very important. We saw very strong demand from European businesses to get this sort of reassurance. And this is now European law. So making the bridge to European cloud certification, EUCS is just there to help providers to demonstrate compliance with the Data Act and other European legislation. This is not aimed at excluding anybody from the market. It's again a tool to help providers to demonstrate compliance. My team has been in charge of free flow of data for many years. It's one of the major regulatory success in Europe. We have managed to remove most legal barriers. Through the Data Act, we will be able to reduce vendor lock-in, and the national legislation that were preventing free flow of data have largely disappeared. However, we start seeing a bit of a worrying trend that new cloud silos are being created at national level because there are different security requirements emerging at national level. So we really want to fight against this, because this will prevent the good continuity of ensuring free flow of data in the EU. So it's very important that we harmonize security requirements for cloud, obviously to demonstrate compliance with the GDPR, with the Data Act, and fight against unlawful access to data, but also to foster data flows at European level and where adequate at global level. And finally, to reassure European businesses and public administration users that their data are safe in the cloud. Thanks a lot. I will stop here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. You touched, of course, as I was expecting, on a lot of topics. I'm guessing that we'll address them through the other speakers as well. And next up, I have Anissa there. You just referred to what's happening also in the member states, and Anissa, of course, is from NUMEOM, so the biggest digital association in France, just like Digital Europe, very diverse association. You have companies big and small in the membership, and you have you're taking the pulse of what's happening in the very lively discussion around cloud in France. And so what does the landscape look like to you from a French perspective? As Pierre reminded us, of course, the cloud market is both cloud providers and cloud users. So everything, how are the two sides of the coin looking at it in France presently?
Many thanks to Digital Europe for the invitation to this panel. And maybe just before answering to the real question, just to give you maybe it's useful just to share one or two figures, about the cloud landscape in France as an example. Of course, it's not, I would say, the EU representation, but just to see, as France, how is it going on this way? So every year, what we do as NUMEOM is we launch a study on the perspective and the growth of the digital market. And according to the last study, so it was from last year, the digital market in France should have reached, I think it was around 65 billion euros. So it was up to 6.3% of growth for the sector, so which is good. And what is interesting with that figure is that the growth of the digital sector is largely driven by the cloud. So it was around, I think, plus 21% of growth. And it's gradual adoption by the large number of organizations. So this is mainly in the study, the main point was like saying, okay, cloud is kind of the main aspect of the digital growth that is, important for the sector in France. So given the need for cloud technologies to compete and of course to continue to grow in our economies, we decided to provide an in-depth look at the state of cloud computing in France. So this is a specific study we are doing at the moment. It's ongoing, but we will of course keep you posted on that one. But now answering to the real question, now that you have a few figures about the landscape, let's be honest on the perspective, or I mean the feeling from the companies on all this, growing of EU initiatives. Cecilia has also mentioned a lot of digital or tech files that are very that are at the moment very important for companies. For now, from what we have on our side, is like it's very overwhelming for companies at the moment to digest all the regulation and initiatives in the making. Of course, we're not speaking only about cloud, so this is our panel, of course, but all these initiatives are, connected, and companies, are also, involved in all this, initiatives. So we have cloud, data, AI, etc. So and just maybe to give you a few numbers on this, among our 2,500 members, the largest part of them are SMEs, very small companies and startups. So I think we have around 70% of this membership that are startups, SMEs, and very small companies. And we have cloud providers, but also a lot of users in our membership. That being said, most of them were not aware of all the regulation that will have an impact on them, especially on data and cloud. And of course, this is our role, as associations, as Digital Europe, NUMEOM, and all these national organizations, to put awareness on these initiatives and help them also to comply with it. And maybe just to give an example on the Data Act, of course, this is an opportunity for companies to adopt multi-cloud strategies, also to choose their cloud providers. But on this side, the main challenge our company sees is mainly that they need guidance on this. So I was happy also to hear from Bart and Pierre on this cloud rulebook. And with all this wave of regulation, companies will be very happy to have some tools, toolbox or things that can help them, to go on the right way of compliance. We saw how it was in France, but I think in whole Europe about the GDPR compliance. It was quite challenging for companies, a lot of like success and also failures. So this is also good to maybe anticipate more about, how we can help companies to comply on this, initiative specifically on the cloud. And Pierre spoke also about self-regulation and all this cloud rulebook and all this guidance. So that will be very useful for the companies at the moment. We know that it's very costly for companies. Cecilia has mentioned it in her introduction. It's very costly, about an administrative burden. Also legal expert they need to hire for this to be compliant. So this is very key for companies to have this guidance on their side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anissa. You also explained very clearly that we're talking about cloud, but I think the discussion about how legislation impacts cloud uptake overall does not only relate to the requirements on, let's say, cloud providers, but most importantly, I would say perhaps more how the overall regulatory framework for data processing impacts how users are able to deploy solutions. So let's definitely go there perhaps, and let's go to a very important category of users, which is the financial sector. We have Barbara Navarro from Santander, a very important European sector and a heavy user already of cloud throughout the, let's say, the customer journey in the banking and financial sector at large. And so, looking at, all the factors of business, legal factors, et cetera, how does a company like Santander look at, their cloud adoption and the choice of cloud solutions that they deploy in Europe and in the other geographies where you are as well?
Hi, well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Look, let me start, and I know that we have talked about challenges. Let me start acknowledging that it's very good that we see that cloud is relevant for business in Europe, right? That's number one. I mean, this 70% cloud adoption is relevant. Then acknowledging that cloud will bring business in Europe to the next level is relevant. Something that was said that I want to highlight also is that we are seeing self-regulation and co-regulation in this space. I think that is critical, right? And it's critical to give balance to regulation too. Okay, then that's but number three, the fact that we are talking about regulation and challenges of regulation to that cloud adoption is also relevant, and I think it's a fact. Then in terms of the finance sector, I mean, let me add an extra layer. The finance sector is a regulated entity. I mean, it operates in a regulated environment, as you know, in a highly regulated environment, which means that that makes even harder, right, to move into the cloud. But at the same time, for a sector as the finance sector, moving into the cloud is critical, right? It's critical for cost efficiency, but it's critical to serve better our customers. It's critical because it's not just us going through our digital transformation, is the sector as a whole is moving into a different space where, as you know, there's many new competitors, right? And as we welcome competition, and I think it's great because it gives more flexibility and options to customers, of course, we need to be able to compete also better, right? And cloud is the tool that we have, to be able to upgrade ourselves. Then in terms of how is this journey, I mean, we are fully committed to move into the cloud. We are very advanced and I mean, we not only because we have moved our, our core services into the cloud, it's also because internally we were able to develop software that speed the process to move data from the finance sector to the cloud. And also I want to highlight some partnership with some big tech players in order to ensure that others can benefit from the software that Santander has developed. Being said that, I mean, and very quickly, things that are critical to move into the cloud. It has been said, interoperability is very important, of course. Geographic expansion. I mean, as a global, a European, but global, with a global presence, we really need to ensure that we have access to cloud service providers that can allow us to be present in different countries. Security and compliance is critical too. Avoid vendor lock-in. I think that this was said already. Then there are different reasons why we choose one cloud service provider or other, but it's not one or the other. Honestly, let me highlight multi-cloud. This is critical too. We need to be able to have access to the best in class, and the best in class can be different depending on the services that we want to use. Last and not least, regulation becomes a challenge, to be honest. And even if I want to stay very positive, I want to highlight that we can't have a purpose of moving European business, 70% of European business to the cloud, and not be extremely careful with the details of the regulation that we put in place. Every single request, to move to the cloud matters. If we put all that together, it becomes a blocker. Then I think that we need to really look into every single, when you have a cloud of very different regulations, imagine that for each regulation we have 10 requests, which is not crazy, right? We end with more than 100 requests. We make this move almost impossible. Then from one side, very positive, welcome the importance of cloud, welcome the effort to move. From the other, I think that we need to be extremely careful on how we frame this, because it is true that depending on how much we move into the cloud faster, we will be more or less competitive. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. So let me ask now a cloud provider. We have Samantha from Oracle. Very happy to have you. We will talk about the complexity. Maybe let's zoom into the Data Act, perhaps, which is the most relevant, the most impactful new piece of legislation that impacts cloud, with specific provisions on cloud. What is your assessment of how that has kind of changed things from a regulatory compliance perspective, and how do you approach it as a company so that you can also contribute to the the broader objectives that we're discussing here, making sure that we have more cloud uptake across Europe, across many sectors of the economy?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Alberto, for having me, and thank you to Digital Europe for putting together the panel. A very esteemed colleagues on this panel. I think we agree with Pierre that the Data Act is going to be a significant piece of legislation. It's going to be very impactful and have a significant impact on innovation and competitiveness in the market. I think several of the panelists have mentioned this, but the acceleration of multi-cloud adoption in Europe will be very important. We hear from many of our customers that they don't want to use just one cloud provider. They want to be able to use many cloud providers. So we believe that's important, as is interoperability. Just last week at our annual cloud conference, we announced a partnership with Microsoft so that Microsoft customers can order Oracle services from within the Azure data center. So this kind of cooperation amongst the vendors and greater interoperability, I think, will become, quite important. It is quite important and will become more prevalent. The other thing that we are strongly supporting is the reduction in arbitrary. I haven't heard anybody else mention this yet, but I think this is also important from the Data Act perspective. The reduction and the gradual elimination of the arbitrary data egress fees. Customers should be able to have their own data whenever they need it. So we strongly support that. I think that some of the other forthcoming initiatives that have been mentioned by the other panelists, such as the EU Cloud Rulebook and the public procurement guidelines, things that are going to create transparency in the cloud market, we very much welcome that. I think the only way that we can have trust in our cloud services is to have this kind of transparency. So clear rules will help ensure that we do meet that objective of having 75% of all cloud businesses, of all businesses using cloud by 2030. I think what's going to be critical to the success of all of this is that these rules, these regulations are written in a clear and open way, in a non-discriminatory way, and in a way that really takes account of all of the the various kinds of cloud services that are out there, whether it's software as a service or platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. So that's right. That's really our view. We do welcome the Data Act.
Thank you, Samantha. Last, I'm going to go to Thomas Hahn from Siemens. To call you one of the sectoral users and deployers of clouds would be incorrect, because you are empowering so many manufacturing sectors of the economy that I mean, you are one of the key people to talk to understand how cloud is being used now as Siemens, and you have cloud integrated into a lot of your offerings already. And so I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is your take on the regulatory legal side of things? You know, how complex do you think this is getting, and what could help there? But also, among the many roles that you have, like our Director General, you're on the board of Gaia X for your second term, so a major public-private partnership, let's call it, but industrial initiative to structure and boost the cloud market in Europe, so that, again, we can reach those goals that we all have. So how do you look at the role of those initiatives going forward?
Many thanks, and hopefully you can hear me, because just before my system decided to shut down, but now I'm back here. Thanks for inviting me. And I would start with a short example from the manufacturing perspective. Also, when I refer to something as reflecting manufacturing topics, that's the home turf where I'm coming from. And I'll show a little bit the role of cloud and what is needed, and then for sure I will touch also the regulation aspects, which anyway was mentioned from the different speakers before. Easy example, when you have a battery, you have on the battery on the one side the operation and the production. That in battery you have to have dependencies of material around the world, and you want to ship also the batteries around the world, or the car where the batteries included to ship around the world. So you need here, let's say, but this was also discussed before in worldwide outreach, and for sure you can imagine that cloud solution is one of the key elements. I'm not referring regarding security, what Cecilia anyway mentioned upfront, what are the topics, because when you're looking at the battery and when you're looking and how the battery is operated in a car, in which circumstances, for sure you can optimize the operation of the battery, but on the other side you get a lot of information data to reproduce, to recycle the battery. And the good message is that of the ingredients of the battery you have around 96% which you can recycle. And coming back again, it was a comment before about that we're depending on material around the world, which of course decreasing, and again a little bit our dependency is an advantage for us, but as you can immediately smell, there's a lot of data cloud uses for optimization of the operation, for optimization of the production, to connect this, and last but not least also to recycle this. So meaning cloud usage is, as you said before, is absolute on the spot. Depending which cloud or which cloud you're offering, you're sometimes depending where the application region is. There was some comment before regarding vendor login to avoid, which is also for us from relevance. And when you're going to the shop floor, also say, on a certain perspective, also edge systems are coming, let's say, onto the scope. But this will mean not contradiction, because to handle this, the cloud edge continuum, by the way, also strength for Europe is needed. This is one topic. Pierre mentioned standards. I cannot agree more about that. We need standards for scaling up. Cloud edge standards, how to exchange information, how to describe the assets, and so on, and to build, let's say, some kind of high-level description on top of this. And last but not least, regulations. Also meaning, in a nutshell, cloud is from essence cloud edge continuum to handle is important, also a benefit for us or strength for Europe. Standardization for scaling up is needed, very needed. But Pierre mentioned this, and for sure, adequate regulation can help us. And I now phrased a little bit the word adequate regulation. I think it was mentioned when I remember from Bart about this rule harmonization. You know, regulation can provide a legal certainty and can also help us to fulfilling European values. By the way, also relevant in other parts of the world. But as we know, and Cecilia has shown a slide, we have a lot of regulation initiatives and so on. And this was also mentioned from Anissa before. When you're looking at big companies like Siemens, maybe we have people to handle this, but when you're looking to small and medium-sized enterprises, by the way, reflecting 80 to 90% of our economy, it's becoming difficult. As a meaning, consistency, clarity, usability, and for the regulation is needed. We are working on this. And only to give you one example is when you're speaking about data and the AI Act, only to push these two out, you know, this is highly dependent because you need the data to train the AI models and so on. And you can imagine that also the consistency between this regulation, between this act is needed. For sure, regulation can help and must help, must reflect European values, but we have still a lot together to do. Pierre mentions this also to make it adaptable and usable, and you know, not hindering innovation and businesses. That's a little bit one part of the question. The other part, you are right. I'm one of Cecilia also is one of the board members of the GAIA-X Association. You know, when I'm reflecting openly about GAIA-X, we have established a huge network in Europe across member states, and partly also around the world. It's good because then you can exchange what is needed, what know-how is needed, where are skill gaps, what are applications, what are lessons learned of the applications, what are lighthouse projects, what are the learning outside this lighthouse, from this lighthouse project to really to improve the offerings from the user side, but also from the provider side. So that's, let's say, which was installed and which is running quite intensive and quite good. For sure, when you speak about industry, the request to GAIA-X Association is to provide us federated services. Cecilia mentioned security, you know, also to have control over the data, to have also this federated aspect. Think about cloud edge continuum or between cloud solutions, and this across verticals. But, you know, I'm allowed to say as a board member, we have still a lot to do ahead of us. So we must, as an organization, become more efficient, faster, providing the offering, supporting the applications, you know, Catena-X in the automotive topic, which are targeting use cases like CO2 footprint or traceability. You know, they're building on GAIA-X. They want to go live during this year, where you have really a big cloud and data application in the backend. So therefore, we are working together really to provide to us, to our members, when they're speaking as an association, some kind of services, agreed services, informations, lessons learned. For sure, as GAIA-X, we have to focus more on this deliverable builds and, you know, putting other questions aside. As a meaning, we have installed something with GAIA-X. We have still a hell of work ahead of us to make it more efficient, but the basic is somehow set.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. We're sort of halfway through the event, and I'm glad to announce that we're doing great on time because all our speakers have been very efficient. Maybe Samantha, I understand you wanted to come in on the very important point that both Anissa and Thomas now just made about the complexity for customers as well, and how to make this more efficient. Do you want to briefly comment and expand a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. I did want to acknowledge that because it is something that we hear from customers a lot, that they need help grappling with some of these regulations. And I want to make it clear that there are some things that cloud providers can do actually to help beyond the regulations. And I think, you know, as cloud providers, we can assign resources to understand all these regulations, not only the ones that impact the cloud services providers, but the ones that impact, for example, our customers in finance. You know, we have assigned teams that focus on this and sort of scan the horizon to ensure that we're always developing our products to the highest bar and ensuring that they're able to be used in any jurisdiction, particularly in the EU, but also elsewhere around the world. So that's I think that's one thing that we can do to help. The other thing that we as cloud providers can do to help, and that, you know, we try to do at Oracle, is to offer a breadth of deployment models. I think some customers have concerns about where their data is located. Other customers have concerns about the classification of their data. Perhaps they have data that's of very high national security data, you know, very high classification. And still, other customers have real commercial considerations. They need the data to be available quickly. So every millisecond matters. And it's important, it's incumbent upon cloud providers to listen to all of those considerations and try to offer a breadth of deployment models, whether it's a model where the cloud services are offered within Europe and operated by European residents, for those who are concerned about data localization, or it's a highly secure model, or a completely disconnected model, or a model that's frankly within the customer's own data center. All of those options should be available to customers. And then the final thing I wanted to say, just to pick up, this was another thing that I heard in the comments that I want to pick up, is that we can also be helping, I think, by doing even just the most straightforward things like mapping some of these regulatory compliance issues to the technical functionality, and helping customers to understand how they might implement the various cloud services to meet their own requirements. So I think, you know, we do hear from customers that they're struggling to understand all of this. Cloud services providers tend to be in a good position to understand this. They're looking at it on a, you know, day in and day out. They're talking with many customers. So I did want to just sort of acknowledge the role that we can play in helping out here and ensuring that there's a greater uptake of cloud services in the EU.
Thanks a lot, Samantha. Okay, so let's now move on to the second segment, where we focus more on security. And Pierre alluded to this, and Bart as well already, that a lot of the discussion now is on the EU cloud scheme that focuses in particular on the security requirements that will be put on cloud services. And again, these are directly applicable to cloud services, so the providers, but users indirectly are also very affected in terms of, you know, what leeway they have to select the providers of their choice. And Bart, you already sort of went there, and I think in your first intervention, but you know, how do you look at this discussion about, I think the word is sovereignty. You know, this is the culmination of the sovereignty discussions, and there's a level of interpretation and disagreement as to what exactly sovereignty includes, what it looks like. And so how do you look at the discussion there when it comes to cloud security and the, you know, the relationship that we have, you know, data localization, Samantha referred to it already, and also the Europeanness of the cloud offerings in Europe? You know, how does this try to structure that?
Well, Alberto, I look at it as a highly political subject, as have the governments of Germany and the UK and the USA have mentioned. And I guess as rapporteur on the NIS2, like you mentioned, the flagship of European cybersecurity laws, which I was rapporteur on, I made an article making sure that we wanted impact assessment, stakeholder involvement, a risk-based assessment, non-political technical implementation of certification schemes. This is not that, this is the opposite. So this stems from the Cybersecurity Act from 2017, and this is not the latest consensus in Brussels from a lawmaker's perspective. So I disapprove of the way that the Commission has worked on this, and I really oppose this EU cloud certification scheme. and because of cybersecurity concerns as well. As I said, it should be risk-based. I've spoken to several companies, and as you've seen in the Dutch impact assessment, which has been shared, some companies say that the EU CS might involve 20 to 300% of cost increase. That will definitely not benefit cybersecurity, which would also not will benefit cybersecurity because it's a cost matter of cost efficiency. The second thing is, I guess that many companies will be pushed towards smaller cloud companies, and smaller cloud companies are generally much less protected. In my experience as director for cybersecurity at the Ministry of Defense in the Netherlands as well, it's much less protected than the large firms. And even more importantly, when I think of the interruption of, let's say, the pooling of cyber threat intelligence back and forth across the Atlantic, which is very important for our security, hampering that with this legislation or with this certification, I must say, is not the right way to go forward. And I would also say that if you look at the foreign laws applying to headquartered companies storing data in the EU, the localization does not guarantee independence from that. So that's also a concern that I have. And if I look, last but not least, to say, if I look at all Snowden documents, 30,000 documents, not one example of intellectual property theft, not one example of intellectual interference, not one example of the non-intervention principle being got. There is no problem with our American allies. There is a problem with Chinese, Russian, and Iranian and Korean allies. They have an offensive espionage program against us, breaching international law. That is the problem. And the Americans, we do not have a problem with. Yes, political espionage is the second oldest profession in the world. The Netherlands does it, Luxembourg does it. That's fair game. But there is no problem at all with the American like-minded community. And we should remain that way. And we should speak about that politically, not through technical security assessments like it's being done by the Commission and ENISA at this moment.
Art, thanks a lot. Like all Dutch people, you have been very direct in your intervention. So I probably should go to Andreas now for some sort of reaction to that. Maybe Pierre wants to chip in as well. So Bart referred to the assessment of the impact of sovereignty and various versions of sovereignty. So the latest numbers that we have about the market share of European cloud providers across Europe is 13% of the market, right? So obviously we want to grow that, but do we know if we've been able to assess whether capacity would be there if we were to have these requirements about sovereignty in place, which effectively would mean that it would be on these providers, European-only providers, to provide services across those critical use cases. So do you have anything, if you looked at this as ENISA, maybe Pierre, I'll let you go right after Andreas.
All right, Alberto, many thanks to Digital Europe for inviting me on this panel. It's quite exceptional to be amidst such important people in this area. Actually, I just want to give a different standpoint to this whole argument because by my reading, as somebody who's been involved in cybersecurity certification since the legislative proposal as the honorable member of the parliament suggested in 2017, September. So we're some water has gone under the bridge. I believe that certification can give way much choice and options, both to the service providers as well as to the buyer, the community that benefits from that. Effectively, when we talk about certification, we have to firstly think, is my service measurable? Is my service transparent enough? And how do I know that? I do know it because somebody took a very close look and they actually produced a conformity assessment report about it. So certification is not a punishment. It is not an imposed regulatory measure to lock things up and provide privileges. It's a matter of market maturity and an additional measure that adds value to the service itself, and it's actually chargeable. A few years ago, we had a discussion on localization. I was in a similar panel making the suggestion that indeed you have localization of services in Europe, much like you have it elsewhere across the globe, Brazil, India, and so forth. So from our ENISA standpoint, which is simply advisory, advisory as a role to the Commission, the member states, to produce some proposals, and by mingling with the technical experts in cybersecurity. So our view was that it's actually a benefit for the service provider because they set up shop where a shop wasn't there in the first place. And then the user community could benefit from high quality and now with certification measurable services that meet compliance objectives and requirements. We had the GDPR, we have much more with the Data Act and much more with everything else that is likely to come along. I think here we have to reflect that we talk about a voluntary scheme. Right now, even if we have the toughest of the tough proposals on the table, which I don't quite believe will be the case, because the discussions are ongoing, the whole framework is voluntary. There's no such thing as anything imposed on anybody in specific. So the scheme does not say to people what to do, but what they can do. They get a choice, one more option to choose from, one tick box for them. Actually, we have to also recognize that we're not living in the unfettered laissez-faire period that probably we waved goodbye to a few years ago. We had, for instance, I was there, Directive 31 of 2000 e-commerce, looking into mere conduit of the service providers, but that was not sufficient. Now we have scaled this up to a dense framework of legislative instruments, numerous. But why do we need that? We need it because the whole environment has become far different than it was 25 years or so ago. We have the whole society being online these days. We have people that cannot fend off for themselves. They cannot permit themselves to choose because they wouldn't know where to start. And the threat landscape has changed quite rapidly. According to the ENISA threat landscape report of 2022, the key concerns were malware and ransomware. But since the good colleagues also took a look at what's likely to happen by 2030, we're shifting to supply chain and misinformation, fake news, which currently top the list. What is that telling us? That from more singular and more reasonably, not easy, but reasonably manageable risks or threats, we shift into an environment which is far more complex, and then we have to take many more variables, not just the suppliers, but also their political masters, the puppeteers behind it. I think this span of 25 years is reminiscent of what happened with the locomotive acts in the 1800s. I believe Samantha knows all about it, with a good example of automobiles or locomotives on public roads that required this red flag to go before them. And of course, you had the speed limit of 2 miles per hour in inhabited areas. Within a span of 25 years, the law started changing and becoming more effective and more practical. And perhaps we can see that, with traffic laws, we're not that far away from it. So here, I believe that since we have user requirements, yes, from member states that require something more to be put on top of the basic, not so basic, but still the technical recommendation for a proposal for EUCS, then we really need to live up to that set of requirements. Hence, the proposal that ENISA has put together, and will continue supporting the Commission and the Member States until the bitter end, until the moment when there will be an agreement or something else. I mean, this is not up to ENISA to suggest. And we don't do it alone. Firstly, I think we need to consider the convergence and the complementarity across schemes. Edge computing is not considered on the EUCS, but we do have the scheme on EU 5G. So you might see that in a fair amount of time in the future, we might just see some progress there. And we also work with the European Standards Organization. CEN has 3 work items from us for the what, the security controls, how, conformity assessment requirements, and the method to carry out risk assessments, taking into account threat intelligence, to produce the required assurance level, which is something very useful for public authorities and risk owners alike that can benefit of something as authoritative as an ENISA product that has been also reprocessed and validated as a European standard. The volume is not a concern as such. I would see that the suggestion on the percentage that you have produced, I trust your figures, blindly. It's a great example, but I would see that as a new application area that has a potential to grow. What you're going to put on EL4 is not necessarily voluminous, but it's probably something that cannot go on the cloud right now. I think that with this, I see Samantha smiling slightly.
Thank you, Andreas. You're not Dutch, but you're also very direct, and we like that very much. I'm also starting to see a lot of some questions popping up on the Q&A box there. So, and I see that Pierre has already answered a couple of them in the chat about the innovation board. So please continue to have questions come in, because I think we'll have hopefully time for questions from the audience. But Pierre, I promise your reaction as well, please.
Okay, thank you very much. This is much appreciated. Let me get a few facts right in the first place on what we're doing here. So cybersecurity certification, it's established in the Cybersecurity Act, not in NIS2. And in that respect, the European Commission and ENISA have fully respected what is in the Cybersecurity Act. Much credit in that respect to Andreas and his team at ENISA for the incredible work they have conducted for several years now in the implementation on a topic that is obviously very sensitive. And that's where indeed there are further discussion that are required. Let me also remind that we have conducted extensive consultation at every step of the process. And we've been very inclusive in the way we have conducted this, both with European and non-European industry. If you look at the composition of the ad hoc working group on European cloud cybersecurity certification, you can see that there is a really diverse representation of cloud service providers and cloud users, again, both from European and non-European actors. I have to remind here the importance of the respect of the EU law. There are different legislation in different parts of the world that have extraterritorial effect, but unattended access to European data is illegal. This has been agreed by the European co-legislator in both the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, and previously, obviously, in the GDPR. But unlawful access is illegal against European law, so that's quite important to remind. EUCS is a voluntary tool at the end of the day. It's an enabler for European cloud service provider, big and small. We have a lot of very good European data service provider in Europe. In the Netherlands, in the rest of Europe, we do have very good cloud service provider. It's not just the global hyperscalers who are delivering very good service. And as several other panelists have pointed out, we need both. We want to encourage multi-cloud approaches. We want to encourage diversity in the provision of cloud services in Europe. We want to leave European business and public users the choice of the type of cloud services that they want to use. But more importantly, when they buy this type of cloud services, we want that the user have reassurance on the level of security from the provider that they are going to pick. I will leave it at this for now. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. And at some point, I'll let Bart sort of briefly, but react, not now though, but particularly about how you felt, you know, how open you felt the process was. But I wanted to just ping you about one specific thing that both you and Andreas stressed. And you stressed very clearly that EUCS is voluntary. Can you like promise that it will stay voluntary? Because I think the worry for most people is that we're going to have a discussion further down the road of making it mandatory, which is where I think people will start to get more worried about what exactly that means for them. Sectors such as banking, for example, which would be, or healthcare, for example, which would likely be the users at the highest level.
Yeah, so the EUCS is a voluntary scheme, absolutely. If somewhere down the line, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but if somewhere down the line there will be a need for regulator at European or national level to make a use of EUCS in legislation, this will be subject to in-depth impact assessment, dedicated impact assessment as per better regulation processes, and of course discussion with the co-legislator. So that's where the political dimension that Mr. Grothuus was advocating will kick in, and absolutely right in that respect. So mandating EUCS into any sector or for any purpose will indeed at this stage require in-depth investigation, economic, social, political discussion to see the impact that this will have.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. So let's continue with national perspectives on this discussion, and I'm going to go to Johan Kleikens from Belgium. And we've seen, again, this sovereignty discussion also happen in a more localized manner, and certainly it has happened in Belgium as well. So what's your Belgian perspective on this whole discussion?
Well, I think we took some time before we reached a position. We listened a lot to stakeholders, and in our perspective, those sovereignty requirements, they are functional requirements. They are customer requirements, primarily. That translate into cybersecurity measures that can be assessed through a cybersecurity scheme. That being said, is when we looked at our stakeholders and we talked a lot to them, never was there any intent on a national level to make this scheme mandatory in what sector soever, but to keep it as a voluntary level. When we look at the way the current proposal is on the table, it's clear that we do not agree with the current proposal, and we have expressed, and last week we discussed with Pierre on the content of the scheme. We think it's very important that we clearly mention that it's a functional requirement that makes a difference in security requirements, and therefore Belgium pleads for having what we technically call the EL3 and the EL4 level, with the EL4 with sovereignty requirements, and the EL3 would be cleaned of any sovereignty requirements, as to state them as equally cyber secure at the level high. And I think it is a position, when I hear in the corridors my colleagues, it is a position that could be seen as a compromise position, but moreover, it's a position that would enable also a modular approach, and that would enable multi-cloud solutions for customers. I think that will be a very important point for Belgium to be able to agree on any conclusion about the cloud scheme, and we've been very open about this, so I have no trouble explaining this. And what we certainly see is that we are moving in the right direction. So we have had these discussions within the CCG group where things are converging, too slow, yes, we admit, but we are converging into the right direction. And I think we should be able to reach this. We should be able to reach such a compromise position. And not to discuss anymore any principle discussions, because we're not that far away of each other. Although the wording and the devil is in the details, the scope limitation remains a very, very, very important issue. And although the intent seems to go all in the same direction. The wording is not there yet, and the wording will still need a thorough discussion.
Thanks a lot, Jan. I want to go back to Barbara because we mentioned the impact on different sectors, and clearly you are, as we said already, a heavily regulated sector. Finance, you have not only NIS2 about making things mandatory or not, but also DORA that has changed the compliance picture for you and your providers quite a lot. So how do you look at the possible sovereignty requirements, and what does that mean for you as a company and for the sector, you think?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think let me come back with something that I heard from the last speakers, and I don't think that, I mean, at least from our side, there's no challenge about the need of a certification. I mean, to be honest, this is a best practice all around the world, and certifications for the use of cloud service providers with different levels of security makes sense, right? That is one. I mean, two, trying to have a sovereignty approach probably has two ways to see at this. One is the promotion of European players, which is good. The other one is the block of foreign players. And maybe, I mean, this is what we are concerned about, right? When you go to, when you apply sovereignty in a way that in real or in practice, what is going to happen is that foreign cloud service providers cannot comply with the requirements, with the sovereignty requirements, and as such, cannot give cloud services providers at that level of certification. In Europe, that's where we think it becomes a problem, right? And it becomes a problem for different reasons. I mean, but the first one is a question that I throw here, but I think that we know all the answer is Europe already prepared, right, to offer, or do we have, European cloud service providers that can give to European companies what they need, to operate at the scale, to be secure, to have a geographic remit, to be to find interoperability, multi-cloud, avoid vendor lock-in, etc., etc., etc. Then I think that's the first thing that it concerns us a lot is, I mean, even when sovereignty from as I said, really increasing, cloud service providers that are European means to block foreign cloud service providers, and as such as a company not having access to the best of the best, whoever provided, right? But I'm not sure if we are yet ready in Europe to the best of the best technology, then that is a concern, right? And we, it's not just from a finance sector point of view. I think that this concern is shared by almost all sectors. Then two more things that I want to highlight, because it has been said also, I have heard a lot, this is voluntary. Even if it is, look, and I have been working on cloud in my previous life, certification is something that the customers will look for, right? It's not that voluntary, which means that those cloud service providers that don't have a certification, I mean, customers automatically will not count on those cloud service providers. Then you compare those that have it and those that don't have it. Then even if it's voluntary, I don't think that will, translate well in real life. And the last but not least, that is not small, bearing in mind the fragmentation world where we live right now, it is true that we do not have a problem with the US, right? It is true that it's not that, it's more about sovereignty of Europe. I think that cloud service providers are putting European business at risks. Then, depending on the driver of that sovereignty request or requirement, I mean, we need to think if we can achieve our goals in a different way, but not harming European business that by the way, want to connect with the previous question. We have a goal of moving European business, 70% of European business to the cloud. Then it's going to be hard to achieve that goal if we limit, the amount of cloud service providers that can operate. And again, I know that we are talking at a very high level security certification, but there is, and I know that it's the local countries who will decide which sectors goes to that high level. But I think it's very concerning to approach, this in a way that can impact Europe at the end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Let me bring in Thomas as well for his comments on sovereignty. Maybe I'm going to ask you about a specific aspect, which, again, Andreas in particular referred to, which is localization, because there's two sides, at least at present, to the sovereignty discussion, which is the ownership and control of the cloud provider in question, so relationship with foreign jurisdictions, and then there's the issue of where the data is located. And so how do you look at this from the perspective of a multinational European conglomerate that operates globally in a number of areas, as I said? What do you think, your needs are in terms of localization? What does it contribute in terms of security? What does it look like from a business continuity perspective, et cetera?
A lot of things from Barbara, also from Bart also said before, or for the other speakers. We are using, maybe a lot of cloud offerings around the world where the needs are. And to be honest, you have the normal attacks. The question is of localization will really help. This technical question mark. The question is, if you solve in the security aspect, maybe with the wrong topic, maybe you have to solve in another area, or with other nicknames. That's the first comment. I'm not so sure if localization will have in a security topic as a technical person spoken, to be honest. Second issue is, as I said before, we have, and this is not only for Siemens, but also for small and medium-sized enterprise, a significant part of the business is outside of Europe. It's a double-digit number, and is nearly independent if you are small or big one. Of course, when you're very small, then it's maybe other rules, but when you're a medium-sized company to a big size in the manufacturing domain, let's say, we have to handle this worldwide. And I think Barbara mentioned this also before, with offerings, but a potential to fulfill the user needs. I gave this example before with the supply chain, the battery, where we get something from outside, and on the other side, we are shipping worldwide the topics where we need some cloud offerings. Third topic is, problems I'm also not aware of when you exclude the above mentioned topics like Bart mentioned. And fourth one, when you have really to localize data, then that's the reason why I'm also highlighting a little bit this edge cloud continuum. Then you may be a little bit closer to the machines than you understand come in a room. As a meaning, I'm also, like the previous speaker, a little bit skeptical, especially regarding the worldwide business, the availability. Will this solve the solution? I'm not speaking what Pierre mentioned about laws, where you have to store maybe your health data or something else. That's a different topic. But in manufacturing, I'm also a little bit skeptical of this really will help.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. So we're close to finish. I think we deserve quick reactions, as quick as you can, both from Bart, and then I think I'm going to let Andreas close to provide his final thoughts and reaction to what we have heard, and then Cecilia is going to wrap up the very interesting already, I think, event that we had. Bart.
Cheers, Alberto. Just very small. As a co-legislator, I'd just like to mention that in the NIS2, the most recent consensus in Brussels, there's a very, very clear consensus that any certification scheme should be merely technical. Is this technical? The German government doesn't think it is. The British government doesn't think it is. The US government doesn't think it is. More than 7 member states have put forward non-paper who say it isn't. So I guess it isn't. It should be discussed, it should be debated. This is not an implementing act. This should be at least delegated, but it should be discussed. And it's not like that. Stakeholder involvement, like I said, the latest stakeholder involvement on this scheme was December 2020. It has been kept in the dark for more than a year. We couldn't even discuss it. So I guess there's something really, really strange about this scheme. This is not the way I would say, as a co-legislator and a rapporteur on cybersecurity, say this is the way we put forward a certification scheme. This is what I'd really like to give back to the previous speakers who disagreed with me, because it's not blunt or open. It's just merely mentioning the facts on what is currently the consensus in Brussels. And that's the thing I'd like to say. I hope for a better co-legislative approach in the future, and let's kill this sovereignty requirements in this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Andreas, you have the privilege of closing with your thoughts, the panel.
And what a privilege this is. Many, many thanks, Alberto. Very briefly, the whole setup of the scheme, the whole setup of the CSA suggests a risk-based approach. And I mentioned already what Denise has done in that regard. A gold-plated Rolls-Royce is not a suitable vehicle for the school run, nor is it a good way to do supermarket shopping. There's more appropriate vehicles to choose from, and the market is offering a very large range. I think something like that could be reflected in relation to the top end of the requirements. But let's not fool ourselves, because these are stakeholder requirements. They come straight from the member states. The member states suggested that the sovereignty aspects should be looked into. The dialogue is ongoing. Johan, who is in the heart of it, mentioned it very clearly. Of course, there is ground to be covered. Let me also highlight that we're talking about what has scaled up to 5 pages out of almost 370. So that gives you the magnitude, but also the complexity of the task, because now we have to do targeted actions, wordsmithing, and find the right balance, the desirable balance, as the Commission and the Member States wish it, and we're there to support them to produce an instrument that will be totally in line with the international commitments of the European Union, and including WTO, of course. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. I want to thank you for taking the task of closing this panel, which I think was very lively. So I want to thank you as a moderator for doing a great job and contributing wonderful thoughts to this discussion. And Cecilia, please hand it over to you.
Well, this is a super easy task. Having 2 minutes to summarize this. First of all, I mean, one thing, fantastic discussion. I think it's a long time since I heard like a really, discussion where all the opinions on this are they are represented and they are clear. So, and that is exactly what is important in policy making, that we have transparency and that we have discussions, with all stakeholders involved. I would say what I hear, and maybe I can try to conceptualize, is there is some kind of tensions between European industrial strategy against security and technical requirements. And I think there is still diverging views on what we are doing here. What is the ultimate goal? Is this a security scheme that provides a safer environment, amongst others, for European user companies to get into the cloud? Well, if that is actually the case, then I would say it's quite clear from industry that we're definitely only in favor of voluntary. We need more insight and more consultations. I do think it's around a few years ago since there was an industry consultation. We want to work with our international partners and have cutting-edge cloud solutions. We do see a lot, amongst others, US as a huge security partner that we do want to work with. So that is definitely on our agenda. Whether there should be like a high plus where there is voluntary extra requirement from certain companies that would like to adhere to that, could be an idea, but still voluntary and still focused only on security and not industrial strategy. Facts on the table. I think it's also timely that Digital Europe, we have many of the user companies. We have 6 of the strongest sectors represented in Digital Europe, also with the bigger companies. that we basically also conduct a survey with our members, looking at, are they moving out of the cloud? What is their opinion and what are their main concerns? You know, I hope that there will be time to discuss this timely and that we get it right. One thing is for sure, the malicious stakeholders on cybersecurity is hardly any one of the ones that we have discussed today. They will always be there, and we need to make sure that we protect ourselves in the best way and that we make our companies global, competitive, and agile. Of course, a user company in manufacturing will have to be able to exchange the data across border. Without that, it will be impossible to function. And of course, they will have to have the access for the best cloud provider, whether that is from our security allies or from European vendors. So with that, I am very happy that we were all in this room, that we were clear in our opinions. Let's be sure that we have the goal at mind to have more security, that we have voluntary schemes, and that we have even more dialogue than we have had in the past before we close the final scheme. One thing is for sure, Europe-wide is definitely supported by Digital Europe. We support that we do this on a European level, but this is extremely important to get this right. Thank you so much to all of you. Great contributions. You know, policy is made up out of different views. Let's get this one right. Thank you so much.